To thousands of Doukhobors, the symbolic heart of their religion, the place of devoted pilgrimage, is the tomb overlooking the junction of the Columbia and Kootenai rivers, in which lie buried their first two leaders in Canada, Peter Verrigan the Lordly and his son Peter Chistiakov, which means Peter the Purger. The tomb of the Verrigans overlooks the area from which, after the Christian community of Universal Brotherhood moved to British Columbia in 1907, Peter the Lordly supervised its affairs. When Peter chose this spot beside the great rivers, it was called Waterloo. That was a name too reminiscent of strife for the pacifist Doukhobors. Because of the glitter of its waters on a summer day, they renamed it Brilliant. It was at Brilliant that Peter the Lordly established his principal home and also the new headquarters of the community. By Peter the Lordly's death in 1924, the Christian community owned almost 22,000 acres in British Columbia, largely orchard land. It retained or purchased another 50,000 acres in the prairie provinces, so that the total area of this largely self-sufficient community of almost 10,000 people was about 112 square miles. It was a state within a state, whose ideals were summed up in the slogan, "Toil and Peaceful Life." In economic terms, this meant that the Doukhobors worked partly to sustain and build up their community. Typical of this aspect was the making of bricks for their big, square community houses. But the community also worked to earn money, and the jam factory at Brilliant, whose KP jams became famous in the West, was their most impressive enterprise. It was on the prairies, where the town of Verrigan remained the center of settlements in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, that the first signs of serious strife appeared, with the emergence of the Sons of Freedom, ideological descendants of Doukhobors who in 1902, in the early days in Canada, had marched naked towards the lands of the sun. It was the very prosperity of the community, the rich harvest won by mechanical means, against which the new zealots raged. They raised the cry of corrupting materialism, a concept always haunting Doukhobors. But they were still few. Most Doukhobors who had stayed in the Christian community of Universal Brotherhood were willing to accept the sheltered world of the community, where they lived frugally by the standards of the Canadian world, but retained not only a pietistic simplicity of outlook, but also a sense of continuity with the Russian past, contained in their customs and language, in the very personality of Peter the Lordly, and in the line of leaders receding in memory into the lost past of Russia. The community houses are now derelict, the orchards are dying, but these are places where villages of 100 or 150 people once flourished, scattered over the lands of the community. Married couples had their own rooms. The young shared dormitories. Food was prepared and eaten in common. The houses were filled with song. Like all human ideals, the Doukhobor ideal was doomed by realities it had tried to ignore.
Members of the Union of Spiritual Communities of Christ have never recognized and do not recognize any political party. They have never given nor will they ever give their votes during elections, thereby are free from any responsibility before God or man for the acts of any government.
Peter the Lordly died in 1924. His son, Peter Chistiakov, arrived in Canada in 1927, having extricated himself with difficulty from Soviet Russia. He called himself Peter the Purger and often claimed to be saving the Doukhobors from their own materialism.
We triumphantly declare, going under the banner of toil and peaceful life, everything demanded of us, which is not contradictory to the law of God and to the faith of Jesus, we will accept, fulfill, and execute, not through fear, but by conscientious
Peter Chistiakov arrived on the eve of the Depression. The Christian community had lacked a leader for 3 years. Since the Lordly's death, it had drifted into the pattern of living by accumulating mortgages. In 1928, on the eve of the Depression, the community owed more than $1 million. It was riven by dissension. The Sons of Freedom grew in numbers and prestige in reaction to each compromise with the outer world. The passions of the zealots increased as the circle of creditors narrowed. Schools were burned in the Kootenays. The tomb of Peter Verrigan was bombed. Peter Chistiakov devised extravagant plans. He started to negotiate a return to Russia. Delegations visited Mexico in search of a more congenial home. In 1938, Canada Trust and the Canadian Bank of Commerce foreclosed. As Peter Chistiakov Verrigan lay dying, the Christian community reached its end. The disintegration of the Christian community had proceeded throughout the 1930s. One manifestation was the emergence of the Sons of Freedom as a separate activist group. Expelled from the community, they established themselves on an arid plateau in the Kootenays, Crestover, the place of the cross, where they still gather under the name of Reformed Doukhobors and under the leadership of Stefan Sorokin. To Crestover in the 1930s gravitated all the malcontents of the Doukhobor sect. The Sons of Freedom were never a homogeneous movement. They included extreme pacifists and potential terrorists. They included the purest believers among the Doukhobors, and also the delinquents. The Sons of Freedom developed activist techniques which combine the symbolic renunciation of materialism with defiance of their Orthodox brethren, and also of the Canadian state, which they held responsible for the loss of lands in BC as well as in the prairies. They burned community buildings and government schools. They blew up power pylons, and the Kootenays were flooded with police. They also burnt their own houses to demonstrate their rejection of material values. Among other forms of defiance, the Sons of Freedom refused to send their children to school. When mass imprisonment failed to turn the parents into model Canadian citizens, BC authorities embarked on the dubious expedient reminiscent of totalitarian countries, of forcibly seizing the children and incarcerating them behind the fences of a special school at New Denver on Slocan Lake. Of the children held at New Denver, some later became embittered terrorists. From 1930, when the first great nude parades took place in Saskatchewan and later in British Columbia, the struggle between Sons of Freedom and Canadian authorities intensified for 3 decades, with more stringent penalties answered by more nude parades, which had a double purpose: to shock the Puritanism of the Canadian WASP and to display their own longing for Adam's innocence. During the winter of 1961-2, the BC government and the Orthodox Doukhobors moved towards solving the problems of the lands foreclosed in 1938 by dividing them among individual owners. The Sons of Freedom sought to prevent this compromise with legality by renewed arson. When the arsonists were imprisoned, the last great Sons of Freedom manifestation took place, as they marched from their mountains to the Fraser Valley and set up a vigil outside the Agassiz prison where their comrades were held. The Sons of Freedom still exist as a zealot faction within the Doukhobor movement. 2 years ago, the last of those who had kept vigil at Agassiz returned to Krestover and built a new village. Their present leader, Stefan Sorokin, is an evangelical preacher, Russian but non-Doukhobor, who arrived in the later 1940s and established an influence over Freedomites disillusioned with the leadership of the Verigans. What role Sorokin played in 1950s violence and in its cessation in the 1960s, nobody but he and his closest followers know for certain. Years ago, he became a resident of Uruguay, and he sustains his influence through periodic visits to his followers in Krestover. There, the Sons of Freedom keep up their traditional rejection of material ostentation. But at the same time, they own their land as individuals. They work in the free enterprise economy. And they do nothing to reassert the holy communism that characterized Doukhobor life under Peter the Lordly, the greatest of the leaders. Today, Grand Forks is the center of Orthodox Doukhoborism. The headquarters of the Union of Spiritual Communities of Christ is situated here, and so is the residence of the incumbent leader, John J. Verrigan. The population of the Sunshine Valley around Grand Forks is more than 50% Doukhobor. Yet only a few relics of the community survive, like the flour mills, built in the days of Peter the Lordly, and still grinding Doukhobor-grown grain for Doukhobor use. Even the Doukhobor farmlands in British Columbia are hardly cultivated, for the irrigation systems fell into decay at the time of foreclosure. Only the carefully tended gardens demonstrate the tradition of intensive cultivation the Doukhobors brought with them from Russia. In the prairies, however, the Doukhobors are still farmers. The great majority there are independents, men whose fathers or grandfathers opted early in the century for individual landowning and rejected the leadership of the Verigans while continuing to sustain such basic beliefs as the rejection of violence and war. Today, the Doukhobor traditions are being rapidly eroded among the independents because of a high rate of intermarriage with non-Doukhobors. A minority of the prairie Doukhobors still belong to the Orthodox organization, the Union of Spiritual Communities of Christ. They live mainly at Cowley in Alberta, where the Christian community of Universal Brotherhood bought land 60 years ago. But even they cultivate their farms individually like their neighbors, and differ from them only in unobtrusive matters, like their religious services, their funeral customs, their vegetarian diet, and their anxiety over the fate of the Russian language. At first sight, Grand Forks looks like a typical interior town of British Columbia. But the Doukhobor presence is quickly evident. British Columbian Doukhobors have lost many of their rural roots and settled in the towns as shopkeepers and restaurant and motel proprietors. Nowadays, the Doukhobors accept a formula of citizenship that declares them to be Canadian subject to the law of God and Jesus Christ. If they are unusual Canadian citizens, they are moral Canadian townspeople. When the Doukhobors came to Canada, they worked as farmers and followed the crafts like blacksmithing and harness making that were incidental to the agrarian life. When Peter the Lordly established the community in British Columbia, they branched out to become brickmakers and masons, loggers and sawmill workers. At first, they carried out such work for the sake of the community. Now they do it for themselves, often working for Doukhobor employers. Some of the most prosperous lumber operations in British Columbia are operated by Doukhobors. They are also active in construction and sometimes build for the cause, as they have done at the new community centre in Brilliant. Under Peter the Lordly, goods were distributed according to need from stores in the Doukhobor settlements, and no cash passed within the community. The cooperatives are the last relics of this system, but now they operate like any other co-op by cash transaction. In their new houses on the regained lands, Doukhobors look from the picture windows and remember how their woman leader, Luceria Kalmikova, once prophesied they would live in glass houses and be concerned with material things. John J. Verrigan holds the title of Honorary Chairman of the Union of Spiritual Communities of Christ. Theoretically, it's an elective office, but there have been no challengers, and Verrigan enjoys by inheritance much of the respect and authority accorded to his ancestor Peter the Lordly.
Now, we have been forwarded an appeal, the Stockholm Appeal of 1975.
The replacement at the end of the 30s of the Christian community by the Union of Spiritual Communities of Christ was more than a change of title. The Christian community tried to achieve economic communism for religious ends, and this involved complex industrial administration. The USCC is a religious body with ethnic overtones. When John J. Verrigan meets its executives and representatives of the young Doukhobors, the subjects discussed are not unlike those of any church council.
The forms will be applied, and you, as editor, Liska, will look after that. Now, but after that meeting, there was a symposium. The symposium, the terms of reference of it is objective study of Doukhobor history and evaluation, proper evaluation. And hopefully, as a result thereof, there will come out from the Doukhobors their own account of what they're all about, instead of the heresies and everything that has been accumulated through the years by other persons who don't possibly understand us. And symposium, Steve, you as administrator, you were there in attendance. What is your impression? Are we on the right track?
Of course, the recap really didn't do the job of the last 16 symposiums, because there were certain highlights that could have been brought out that weren't. I was very pleased with your speech, especially to the element that has been creating most of the problem in sending out hate literature and doing property damage and so on. The point was well brought across by
the symposium, which John J. Verrigan discusses with Steve Babakayev, administrator of the USCC, and later with Peter Soloviev, editor of the periodical Iskra, is an attempt made over the past 2 years to draw various Doukhobor factions into an atmosphere of friendly discussion, centered on the need to prepare an accurate historical record of their past.
First meeting after recess, and I think that there will be a renewed effort from the committee and from the public to carry on this work to a successful end.
At one time, Doukhobors distrusted the written word. The body of psalms and hymns called the Living Book was transmitted orally. But the influences of the modern world have eroded oral traditions, and the Doukhobors have accepted the uses of print. The USCC publishes its paper Iskra, and the young Doukhobors publish a magazine called Mir. Iskra means the spark, symbolizing the Spirit of God within each of us. Mir is the traditional Russian word for community. One of the special concerns of modern Doukhobors is the retention of their language. Like most ethnic groups, they realize that the younger people are tending to lose it. And this they find especially alarming because they regard singing in Russian as an essential part of their religion. This is why they often talk even now of returning to Russia, and why they attach such importance to the teaching of the language.
Лиза, Тамара, Володя, Кузьма и Илюша.
In the past, Doukhobor settlements tried to run their own Russian schools. Now, in Grand Forks at least, they have secured the inclusion of Russian in the public school curriculum.
Which syllable is stressed? 1, 2, 3 и 4. Так? Хорошо. Ну так, школа, Елена. Школа. Школа. Тюня? 1, хорошо.
Another way of retaining young people within a Doukhobor frame of reference has been the creation of youth choirs from various Doukhobor centers, like this choir from the Kootenais, which practices in the village of Utasheni under the direction of a local teacher, Peter Samoylov. Youth choirs are not merely a means to hold young Doukhobors together. They have also been used actively to create good relations with non-Doukhobors. They perform on occasions like the present one, the opening of the Castlegar Arena. They appeared at Habitat in Vancouver. They have toured across Canada and south of the border. But even this activity has produced its own form of assimilation, and many songs the choirs now sing have no part in Doukhobor tradition.
The idea of these symposiums had its beginning at a yearly meeting of the Society of Doukhobors of Canada, held in Salmo some time ago.
The symposium is now in session. It was originally intended for Doukhobors of every opinion, and according to some observers, there are as many shades of opinion as there are Doukhobors. But it has been difficult to sustain this open approach. Early on, a small group of zealots sought to disrupt the gatherings and were excluded. But still, there are times when Sons of Freedom appear to make their views known, and if their approach is one of reasoning, they are always heard.
I wanted to inquire as to what has been done in the time since I asked you some 3 months ago regarding the women that are confined in prison. We have a saying, which is very to the point. The saying maintains that, as you sow, so you shall reap. It appears that the women ended up there for the deeds they had sown. Let them find a way to change their deeds so that they would be fruitful. That is, so that they would be able to be free and worthy. This is my answer to you. I would like to say, on behalf of all those present, that we fully support our honorary chairman for clarifying the objectives of these symposiums, that they continue in this spirit with God's help, and we are all in agreement with his words.
Спасибо, Господи, братья и сестры, я очень признателен за ваше чувство, выраженное вами.
Doukhobor life has changed dramatically since 1899, when the first members of the sect landed in their sheepskin coats at Halifax. But in spite of the changes, in spite of the abandonment of the communitarian existence, in spite of the regard for material values implied by the modern Doukhobor way of living, in spite of the customs no longer observed, the psalms forgotten, the language less spoken, in spite of the inclination of young and old to take on protective North American coloring, there is a tenacity in the way the Doukhobors still hold themselves a people apart from others. They preach the brotherhood of all men, yet they do not seek converts. They reject violence and politics, yet they accept no authority beyond their own consciences. Only the next generation will show if they can resist material prosperity as effectively as they resisted so long ago the tyranny of the Russian Tsar.